Good morning, Your Excellency, Minister of Water and Energy of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Alemayehu Tegenu, Dr. Pachauri, Chair of the IPCC, Dr. Sokona, Edenhofer, Pix Madruga, lead authors of the IPCC Working Group 3, coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center, my colleague Fatima Denton. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by welcoming you to the UN Economic Commission for Africa and to the city of Addis Ababa. Although the city may sometimes demonstrate the impacts of climate change and variability, Addis Ababa does offer the kind of serene atmosphere and temperate climate conducive to the level of engagement and quality of discussions that you will be engaged in. ECA is pleased to host you, and it is very important for us to have this opportunity. The Commission is itself in the process of implementing a transformational agenda that will further align Africa's priorities to our research orientation. Research and appropriate deployable knowledge are fundamental vectors to enable us to support the transformation of Africa's economies, pursuing equitable growth, harnessing opportunities to enable Africa to engage new green technologies and reduce dependency on primary production and old technologies that are not compatible with the low carbon growth that we are looking for. Building a strong research infrastructure will help to stem the externalization of African intellectual capacity and promote investment of African knowledge capital in a climate-resilient development. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, the tide is changing. Africa is becoming a scientific hub where researchers, through the strength of their empirical work, are breaking new scientific ground on ICT, HIV/AIDS, and other research areas critical to Africa's development. The paradox is that African research results are not always recognized by policymakers or the global research community. This is partly due to the fact that African research is not always visible within the traditional framework of scientific scholarship and credibility. I applaud the efforts of the IPCC to encourage African scientists to engage in the peer review process and give their research the credibility it needs to convince decision makers that robust scientific findings support the solutions offered. Nevertheless, the peer review process is still associated with a sense of exclusivity, and I would encourage the IPCC to make more efforts to widen the discursive space that will enable African scientists to make visible important research outcomes that are aligned to IPCC standards of scientific rigor and excellence, and to the needs of Africa's decision and policymakers. The last decade has brought remarkable changes to Africa. It saw the end of several wars in hotspots across the continent and ushered in some 5 years of steady economic growth, making analysts to refer to this new phenomenon as the African decade, or the continent of the future. Certainly, these conclusions were arrived at because some of the largest growing economies in the world are now in Africa. The fastest growing economies in the world are now in Africa. They were also supported in this analysis by the relative ease with each African countries went through the global economic and financial downturn of 2008 and 2009. Yet, this is only one side of the African story. The other side of the same story is not as flattering. High rates of unemployment among African youths, pervasive poverty in urban and rural areas, especially amongst women and marginalized groups, endemic food shortages, lack of adequate infrastructure, and threats to development as a result of climate change all point to the need for concerted action to sustain current growth trends in the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, climate is an important resource in African economies. It is also a major hazard and has the potential to negatively impact the lives and livelihoods of resource-dependent communities. The climate system in Africa is poorly understood. The impacts of climate variability and change take their toll on economic development and socio-ecological resilience. Potential impacts arising from climate change may further impair the ability of vulnerable communities to fully utilize natural resources such as water and food. Agricultural systems are particularly vulnerable and responsive to climate change and climate shocks, and can have devastating impacts on the livelihood structure of rural and urban populations. Good climate forecasts and surveillance systems will help African populations manage this important resource and translate vulnerabilities into opportunities in critical climate-sensitive sectors. Climate forecasting systems and strategies and new technologies should coexist with a vibrant indigenous forecasting culture, which needs to be preserved as an essential part of the climate response strategies. Many regions in Africa experience frequent extreme weather and increasingly unpredictable climate. Africa encompasses some of the world's regions that are most vulnerable to climate change. Droughts, floods, and desertification are frequent occurrences, affecting economic livelihoods and making the mapping of climate hotspots and possible adaptation strategies extremely difficult. Between 1997 and 2007, this country, Ethiopia, lost an average of 1.1 billion to drought every year. In the Sahel, farmers and livestock herders have witnessed a 25% decrease in rainfall in the past 30 years. Much needs to be done to make countries in Africa more resilient to climate-related disasters. The challenge is not just in forestalling current climate impacts and the way these impacts are distributed across the scale and social groups. It is to implement short, medium, and long-term comprehensive risk management strategies and to scale this out in ways that will increase the buffer potential of vulnerable groups and countries. Your Excellencies, our determination to establish the African Climate Policy Center is born out of this belief that knowledge in climate science is a fundamental part of the adaptation and mitigation strategy. Understanding climate risks and threats is the first step towards reducing vulnerability to climate-related hazards and increasing the practical value of climate information to reduce poverty. Insulating Africa's vulnerable poor from climate shocks and extremes will necessitate identifying and implementing effective climate risk management. Given the devastating impacts of climate change on the economics of the region, the Economic Commission for Africa, ECA, together with the African Union and the African Development Bank, have pooled their resources to establish ClimDev Africa, Climate for Development in Africa program. With substantial support from development partners, the program aims to create a solid foundation for the African response to climate. The ClimDev Africa vision is to position Africa at the forefront of knowledge generation in ways that will allow vulnerable communities, governments, and the private sector to translate climate-related knowledge into effective development outcomes for the continent. These strategies cannot be achieved in the absence of reliable and credible climate information and services. The challenge that ClimateDev Africa faces is not just in the accessibility of climate information, but in the utility of this and the opportunities they provide to reduce multiple risks in key vulnerable sectors like agriculture, water, energy, and indeed health. The ClimateDev mandate is fundamentally linked to improving the provision of climate information and integrating these services into development planning. As a matter of fact, the choice of the theme of the 7th African Development Forum that normally we organize in this very conference center was acting on climate change for sustainable development in Africa, and came from the recognition by African governments and key development partners of the region about the need to begin high-level regional conversations on the potential constraints that climate change portends for the continent. The establishment of the African Climate Policy Center, which we are happy to host and support, came as a result of our common resolve to place African scientists, policymakers, and private sector at the forefront of the debate, research, negotiations, and policy formulation to tackle climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, you know that for long, Africa's focus of choice has been on adaptation, as clearly spelled out in the African Common Position table at COP15 in Copenhagen already in 2009. This does not mean that mitigation is not important for Africa. In fact, many African countries are actively engaged in finding ways to address climate change in ways that do not compromise development and growth. Some argue that land use mitigation options will lead to cheaper results than traditional mitigation technologies in the energy and industrial sectors, except energy efficiency. Others hold the view that these options constitute no-regret solution with co-benefits such as reduced air and water pollution, water conservation, and many others. The point I want to make is that there are ongoing initiatives and discussions across the continent to develop low-emission and climate-resilient strategies in various sectors, including energy, transport, agriculture, land use, forestry, households, and industry. I am happy to note that the current work program of the African Climate Policy Center covers most of these sectors. Without preempting the outcomes of your report, the location and intellectual mix of people present here today give me an opportunity to pose a few questions about the nature of the ongoing debate about the viability of mitigation as an option for fighting the impacts of climate change in this region of the world. I stress this region of the world because Africa's per capita emissions, on average, are less than 1/6 of those from industrialized countries. Yet, recent studies, backed by scientific evidence, point to the likelihood that greenhouse gas emissions from developing countries could surpass those from developed countries within the first half of this century. But those are statistics on all developing countries, including Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and Turkey, and just one country from Africa, South Africa. ECA is at a critical juncture in its restructuring process. A number of studies led the management of this commission under my leadership to the conclusion that the Commission needed major changes to remain relevant in a changing global environment. In order to remain pertinent to the transformative agenda of the continent, the Commission is actively retooling and recalibrating its work. I share the conclusions of studies that say Africa must change the way it conducts business in order to address identified priorities for its accelerated transformation. I would like to leave you with one thought. Current demographic dynamics in Africa present a new challenge. It is reported that in less than 3 generations, 41% of the world's youth will be African. It is believed that between 2010 and 2020, Africa will add 163 million people to its potential labor force. Our collective interest is strongly rooted in our ability to institute the behavioral response that will ensure that whilst cognizant of risk-sharing approach that I mentioned several times, we are also willing to spread opportunities that will provide safety nets to this and future generations. Development calls for a critical reevaluation of the way we conduct our affairs, of the way we source, gather, and analyze our data. Because if we do not have full command of these processes, we cannot lay claim to the narrative of our development pathways. This holds true for climate change, and I think holds true for many other areas. That is the reason I think it is imperative for us to look into these challenges ahead and provide the responses that are compatible with the importance they represent for our future generations. I wish you a fruitful meeting, and thank you very much for your attention.